Travels with a Donkey in the Cevennes by Robert Louis Stevenson. Episode 5, A Night Among the Pines.
The wind fell during dinner, and the sky remained clear, so it was under better auspices that I loaded Modestine before the monastery gate. My Irish friend accompanied me so far on my way. As we came through the wood, there was Père Apollinaire hauling his barrow. He too quitted his labours to go with me for perhaps 100 yards, holding my hand between both of his in front of him. I parted from one and then from the other with unfeigned regret, but yet with the glee of the traveller who shakes off the dust of one stage before hurrying forth on another. Then Modestine and I mounted the course of the Allier, which led us back into Gévaudan towards its sources in the forest of Mercoeur. It was but an inconsiderable burn before we left its guidance. Thence, over a hill, our way lay through a naked plateau, until we reached Chasserades at sundown. The company in the inn kitchen that night were all men employed in survey for one of the projected railroads. They were intelligent and conversable, and we decided the future of France over hot wine, until the state of the clock frightened us to rest. There were 4 beds in the little upstairs room, and we slept 6. But I had a bed to myself, and persuaded them to leave the window open. "Eh, bourgeois, il est 5 heures," was the cry that wakened me in the morning. The room was full of a transparent darkness, which dimly showed me the other 3 beds and the 5 different nightcaps on the pillows. But out of the window the dawn was growing ruddy in a long belt over the hilltops, and day was about to flood the plateau. The hour was inspiriting, and there seemed a promise of calm weather which was perfectly fulfilled. I was soon under way with Modestine. I was now led by my good spirits into an adventure which I relate in the interest of future donkey drivers. Beyond the gully of Chassezac, the road zigzagged so widely on the hillside that I chose a shortcut by map and compass, and struck through the dwarf woods to catch the road again upon a higher level. It was my one serious conflict with Modestine. She would none of my shortcut. She turned in my face, she backed, she reared. She, whom I had hitherto imagined to be dumb, actually brayed with a loud hoarse flourish, like a cock crowing for the dawn. I plied the goad with one hand, with the other, so steep was the ascent, I had to hold on to the pack-saddle. 6 times she was nearly over backwards on top of me. 6 times, from sheer weariness of spirit, I was nearly giving it up and leading her down again to follow the road. But I took the thing as a wager, and fought it through. From Blémar, after dinner, I set out to scale a portion of the Lozère. At the top of the woods, I struck leftward by a path among the pines, until I hit on a dell of green turf, where a streamlet made a spout over some stones to serve me for a water tap. The trees were not old, but they grew thickly round the glade. There was no outlook except northeastward upon distant hilltops, or straight upward to the sky, and my encampment felt secure and private like a room. By the time I had made my arrangements and fed Modestine, the day was already beginning to decline. I buckled myself to the knees into my sack and made a hearty meal, and as soon as the sun went down, I pulled my cap over my eyes and fell asleep. Night is a dead, monotonous period under a roof, but in the open world it passes lightly, with its stars and dews and perfumes, and the hours are marked by changes in the face of nature. What seems a kind of temporal death to people choked between walls and curtains is only a light and living slumber to the man who sleeps afield. And there is one stirring hour unknown to those who dwell in houses, when a wakeful influence goes abroad over the sleeping hemisphere, and all the outdoor world are on their feet. When that hour came to me among the pines, I wakened thirsty. My tin was standing by me half full of water. I emptied it at a draught, and feeling broad awake after this internal cold aspersion, sat upright to make a cigarette. The stars were clear, coloured and jewel-like, but not frosty. A faint silvery vapour stood for the Milky Way. All around me the black fir points stood upright and stock still. By the whiteness of the pack saddle I could see Modestine walking round and round at her tether. I could hear her steadily munching at the sward, but there was not another sound, save the quiet talk of the runnel over the stones. As if to be more like a pedlar, I wear a silver ring. This I could see faintly shining as I raised or lowered the cigarette, and at each whiff the inside of my hand was illuminated, and became for an instant the highest light in the landscape. And yet even while I was exulting in my solitude, I became aware of a strange lack. I wished a companion to lie near me in the starlight, silent and not moving, but ever within touch. For there is a fellowship more quiet than even solitude, and which, rightly understood, is solitude made perfect. And to live out of doors with the woman a man loves is of all lives the most complete and free. As I thus lay, between content and longing, a faint noise stole towards me through the pines. I thought at first it was the crowing of cocks or the barking of dogs at some very distant farm, but steadily and gradually it took articulate shape in my ears until I became aware that a passenger was going by upon the high road in the valley, and singing loudly as he went. There was more of goodwill than grace in his performance, but he trawled with ample lungs, and the sound of his voice took hold upon the hillside and set the air shaking in the leafy glens. There is a romance about all who are abroad in the black hours, and with something of a thrill we try to guess their business. But here the romance was double. First, this glad passenger, lit internally with wine, who sent up his voice in music through the night, and then I, on the other hand, buckled into my sack, and smoking alone in the pine woods between 4,000 and 5,000 feet towards the stars. When I awoke again, I saw a faint haze of light upon the horizon. I lit my lantern, and by its glowworm light put on my boots and gaiters. Then I broke up some bread from Modestine, filled my can at the water tap, and lit my spirit lamp to boil myself some chocolate. While I was thus delaying, a gush of steady wind as long as a heavy sigh poured direct out of the quarter of the morning. It was cold, and set me sneezing. 10 minutes after, the sunlight spread at a gallop along the hillside, scattering shadows and sparkles, and the day had come completely. I hastened to prepare my pack and tackle the steep ascent that lay before me, but I had something on my mind. It was only a fancy, yet a fancy will sometimes be importunate. I had been most hospitably received and punctually served in my green caravanserai. The room was airy, the water excellent, to say nothing of the tapestries or the inimitable ceiling, nor yet of the view commanded from the windows. I felt I was in someone's debt for all this liberal entertainment, and so it pleased me, in a half-laughing way, to leave pieces of money on the turf as I went along, until I had left enough for my night's lodging. I trust they did not fall to some rich and churlish drover. The Lozère lies nearly east and west, cutting Gévaudan into 2 unequal parts. Behind was the upland northern country, through which my way had lain, peopled by a dull race, without wood, without much grandeur of hill form, and famous in the past for little besides wolves. But in front of me, half-veiled now in sunny haze, lay a new Gévaudan, rich, picturesque, illustrious for stirring events. Speaking largely, I was in the Cevennes at Monastier, and during all my journey. But there is a strict and local sense in which only this confused and shaggy country at my feet has any title to the name, and in this sense the peasantry employ the word. These are the Cevennes with an emphasis, the Cevennes of the Cevennes. In that indecipherable labyrinth of his, a war of bandits, a war of wild beasts, raged for 2 years between the Grand Monarch with all his troops and marshals on the one hand, and a few thousand Protestant mountaineers upon the other. 180 years ago, the Camisards held a station even on the Lozère where I stood. They had an organisation, arsenals, a religious and military hierarchy. Their affairs were the discourse of every coffee-house in London. England sent fleets in their support. Their leaders prophesied and murdered. With colours and with drums, and the singing of old French psalms, their bands sometimes affronted daylight, marched before walled cities and dispersed the generals of the king, and sometimes at night, or in masquerade, possessed themselves of strong castles and avenged treachery upon their allies and cruelty upon their foes. Strange generals, who moved apart to take counsel with the god of hosts, and fled or offered battle, set sentinels or slept in an unguarded camp, as the spirit whispered to their hearts. I should find it difficult to tell in what particulars Pont de Montvert, to which I descended, differed from Monastier, or Langogne, or even Blémard, but the difference existed, and spoke elegantly to the eyes. The place, with its houses, its lanes, its glaring riverbed, wore an indescribable air of the south. All was Sunday bustle in the streets and in the public house, as all had been Sabbath peace among the mountains. There must have been a score of us at dinner by noon, and after I had eaten and drunken and sat writing up my journal, I suppose as many more came dropping in one after another, or by twos and threes. In crossing the Lozère, I had not only come among new natural features, but moved into the territory of a different race. These people, as they hurriedly dispatched their viands in an intricate swordplay of knives, questioned and answered me with a degree of intelligence which excelled all I had met, except among the railway folk at Chasserades. They had open, telling faces, and were lively in both speech and manner. They not only entered thoroughly into the spirit of my little trip, but more than one declared, if he were rich enough, he would like to set forth on such another. Even physically there was a pleasant change. I had not seen a pretty woman since I left Monastier, and there but one. Now, of the three who sat down with me to dinner, one was certainly not beautiful. A poor, timid thing of 40, quite troubled at this roaring table d'hôte, whom I squired and helped to wine, and pledged and generally tried to encourage, with quite a contrary effect. But the other two, both married, were both more handsome than the average of women. And Clarisse, what shall I say of Clarisse? She waited the table with a heavy, placable nonchalance, like a performing cow. Her great grey eyes were steeped in amorous languor. Her features, although fleshy, were of an original and accurate design. Her mouth had a curl, her nostrils spoke of dainty pride. Her cheek fell into strange and interesting lines. It was a face capable of strong emotion, and, with training, it offered the promise of delicate sentiment. Before I left, I assured Clarisse of my hearty admiration. She took it like milk, without embarrassment or wonder, merely looking at me steadily with her great eyes, and I own the result upon myself was some confusion. If Clarisse could read English, I should not dare to add that her figure was unworthy of her face. Hers was a case for stays, but that may perhaps grow better as she gets up in years.
Alan Cumming was reading the 5th episode of Travels with a Donkey in the Cevennes by Robert Louis Stevenson. Travels with a Donkey in the Cevennes by Robert Louis Stevenson. Episode 6, The Camisard.
Pont de Montvert, or Green Hill Bridge, as we might say, is a place memorable in the story of the Camisards. It was here that the war broke out, here that the southern Covenanters slew their Archbishop Sharp. The persecution on the one hand, the febrile enthusiasm on the other, are almost equally difficult to understand in these quiet modern days, and with our easy modern beliefs and disbeliefs. The Protestants were one and all beside their right minds with zeal and sorrow. They were all prophets and prophetesses. Children at the breast would exhort their parents to good works. Marshal Villars had seen a town where women seemed possessed by the devil and had trembling fits. A prophetess of Vivarais was hanged at Montpellier because blood flowed from her eyes and nose, and she declared that she was weeping tears of blood for the misfortunes of the Protestants. And it was not only women and children. Stalwart, dangerous fellows, used to swing the sickle or to wield the forest axe, were likewise shaken with strange paroxysms, and spoke oracles with sobs and streaming tears. A persecution unsurpassed in violence had lasted near a score of years, and this was the result upon the persecuted. Hanging, burning, breaking on the wheel had been in vain. The dragoons had left their hoof marks all over the countryside. There were men rowing in the galleys, and women pining in the prisons of the church, and not a thought was changed in the heart of any upright Protestant. Now, the head and forefront of the persecution, François de Langlade du Chélat, archpriest of the Cévennes and inspector of missions in the same country, had a house in which he sometimes dwelt, in the town of Pont de Montvert. This served him as a prison. There he closed the hands of his prisoners upon live coal. He plucked out the hairs of their beard to convince them they were deceived in their opinions. Not only was life made intolerable in Languedoc, but flight was rigidly forbidden. One Massip, a muleteer and well acquainted with the mountain paths, had already guided several troops of fugitives in safety to Geneva. On him, with another convoy consisting mostly of women dressed as men, du Chélat, in an evil hour for himself, laid his hands. The Sunday following, there was a conventicle of Protestants in the woods, where there stood up one Séguier, Spirit Séguier, as his companions called him, a wool-carder, tall, black-faced and toothless, but a man full of prophecy. He declared, in the name of God, that the time for submission had gone by, and they must betake themselves to arms for the deliverance of their brethren and the destruction of the priests. The next night a sound disturbed the inspector of missions as he sat in his prison house. The voices of many men raised in psalmody drew nearer and nearer through the town. He ordered his soldiers to report, but the psalm singers were already at his door, 50 strong, led by the inspired Séguier, and breathing death. The archpriest bade his garrison fire upon the mob. One Camisard, for according to some it was in this night's work that they came by the name, fell. His comrades burst in the door with hatchets and a beam of wood, overran the lower story of the house, set free the prisoners, and finding one of them in a vine, a sort of scavenger's daughter of the place and period, redoubled in fury against du Chélat, and sought by repeated assaults to carry the upper floor. But he, on his side, had given absolution to his men, and they bravely held the staircase. "Children of God," cried the prophet, "hold your hands. Let us burn the house with the priest and satellites of Baal." The fire caught readily. Out of an upper window, du Chélat and his men lowered themselves into the garden by means of knotted sheets. Some escaped across the river under the bullets of the insurgents, but the archpriest himself fell, broke his thigh, and could only crawl into the hedge. When the roof fell in, the upbursting flames discovered his retreat, and they came and dragged him to the public place of the town, raging and calling him damned. "If I be damned," said he, "why should you also damn yourselves?" One by one, Séguier first, the Camisards drew nearer and stabbed him. "This," they said, "is for my father broken on the wheel. This is for my brother in the galleys. That for my mother or my sister imprisoned in your accursed convents." Each gave his blow and his reason. Then all kneeled and sang psalms around the body till dawn. Then, still singing, they defiled away towards Fougères, further up the Tarn, to pursue the work of vengeance, leaving Duchela's prison house in ruins and his body pierced with 52 wounds upon the public place. But the story does not end with the departure of the Camisards. The career of Seguier was brief and bloody. 2 more priests and a whole family at La Devèze, from the father to the servants, fell by his hand or his orders, and yet he was but a day or 2 at large, and restrained all the time by the presence of the soldiery. Taken at length by a famous soldier of fortune, Captain Poole, he appeared unmoved before his judges. "Your name?" they asked. "Pierre Seguier." "Why are you called Spirit?" "Because the Spirit of the Lord is with me." "Your domicile?" "Lately in the desert, and soon in heaven." "Have you no remorse for your crimes?" "I have committed none. My soul is like a garden full of shelter and of fountains." At Pont de Montvert, on the 12th of August, he had his right hand stricken from his body and was burned alive. Duchela's house still stands, with a new roof, beside one of the bridges of the town, and if you are curious, you may see the terrace garden into which he dropped. A new road leads from Pont de Montvert to Florac by the valley of the Tarn. A smooth, sandy ledge, it runs about halfway between the summit of the cliffs and the river, and I went in and out, as I followed it, from bays of shadow into promontories of afternoon sun. This was a pass like that of Killiecrankie, a deep, turning gully in the hills, with the Tarn making a wonderful hoarse uproar far below, and craggy summits standing in the sunshine far above. Between Modestine's laggard humour and the beauty of the scene, we made little progress, and at last, finding the sun, although far from setting, was already beginning to desert the narrow valley, I cast about for a place to camp in. After perhaps a mile, I saw, some 60 feet above the road, a little plateau, large enough to hold my sack, and securely parapeted by the trunk of an aged and enormous chestnut. Thither, with infinite trouble, I goaded and kicked the reluctant Modestine, and there I hastened to unload her. There was only room for myself on the plateau, and I had to go nearly as high again before I found so much as standing room for an ass. It was on an artificial terrace, certainly not 5 feet square in all. Here I tied her to a chestnut, and having given her corn and bread and made a pile of chestnut leaves, of which I found her greedy, I descended to my own encampment. The position was unpleasantly exposed. 1 or 2 carts went by on the road, and as long as daylight lasted I concealed myself, for all the world like a hunted Camisard, behind my fortification of a vast chestnut trunk, for I was passionately afraid of discovery and the visit of jocular persons in the night. Moreover, I saw that I must be early awake, for these chestnut gardens had been the scene of industry no further gone than on the day before. The slope was strewn with lopped branches, and here and there a great package of leaves was propped against a trunk. For even the leaves are serviceable, and the peasants use them in winter by way of fodder for their animals. I picked a meal in fear and trembling, half lying down to hide myself from the road, and I dare say I was as much concerned as if I had been a scout from Jaune's band above upon the Lozère, or from Salomon's across the Tarn in the old times of psalm-singing and blood. This was a very different camp from that of the night before in the cool and silent pine woods. It was warm and even stifling in the valley. The shrill song of frogs, like the tremolo note of a whistle with a P in it, rang up from the riverside before the sun was down. A profusion of large ants swarmed upon the ground. Bats whisked by, and mosquitoes droned overhead. The long boughs with their bunches of leaves hung against the sky like garlands, and those immediately above and around me had somewhat the air of a trellis, which should have been wrecked and half overthrown in a gale of wind. Just as I was beginning to feel quiet stealing over my limbs, a noise at my head startled me broad awake again, and I will frankly confess it, brought my heart into my mouth. It was such a noise as a person would make, scratching loudly with a fingernail. It came from under the knapsack which served me as a pillow, and it was thrice repeated before I had time to sit up and turn about. Nothing was to be seen. Nothing more was to be heard. But for a few of these mysterious rustlings far and near, and the ceaseless accompaniment of the river and the frogs. I learned next day that the chestnut gardens are infested by rats. Rustling, chirping, and scraping were probably all due to these, but the puzzle for the moment was insoluble, and I had to compose myself for sleep as best I could in wondering uncertainty about my neighbours. I was wakened in the grey of the morning by the sound of footsteps not far off upon the stones, and opening my eyes I beheld a peasant going by a footpath I had not hitherto observed. He turned his head neither to the right nor the left, and disappeared in a few strides among the foliage. Here was an escape. But it was plainly more than time to be moving. I fed Modestine with what haste I could, but as I was returning to my sack, a man and a boy unintelligibly hailed me. The pair, who seemed to be father and son, came slow up and stood beside me for some time in silence. The bed was open, and I saw with regret my revolver lying patently disclosed on the blue wool. At last, after they had looked me all over, and the silence had grown laughably embarrassing, the man demanded in what seemed unfriendly tones, "You have slept here?" "Yes," said I, "as you see." "Why?" he asked. "My faith," I answered lightly, "I was tired." He next inquired where I was going and what I had had for dinner, and then, without the least transition, "C'est bien," he added, "come along." And without another word they turned off to the next chestnut tree but one, which they set to pruning. The thing had passed off more simply than I hoped. He was a grave, respectable man, and his unfriendly voice did not imply that he thought he was speaking to a criminal, but merely to an inferior. I was soon on the road, nibbling a cake of chocolate, and seriously occupied with a case of conscience. Was I to pay for my night's lodging? I had slept ill. The bed was full of fleas in the shape of ants. There was no water in the room. The very dawn had neglected to call me in the morning. I might have missed a train, had there been any in the neighbourhood to catch. Clearly I was dissatisfied with my entertainment, and I decided I should not pay, unless I met a beggar. The valley looked even lovelier by morning, and soon the road descended to the level of the river. I made my morning toilette in the water of the tarn. It was marvellously clear, thrillingly cool. The soapsuds disappeared as if by magic in the swift current, and the white boulders gave one a model for cleanliness. I went on with a light and peaceful heart, and sang songs to the spiritual ear as I advanced. Suddenly, up came an old woman, who point-blank demanded alms. "Good," thought I, "here comes the waiter with the bill." And I paid for my night's lodgings on the spot. Take it how you please, but this was the first and the last beggar that I met with during all my tour.
Alan Cumming was reading the 6th episode of Travels with a Donkey in the Cevennes by Robert Louis Stevenson. Travels with a Donkey in the Cevennes by Robert Louis Stevenson. Episode 7, The Heart of the Country.
On a branch of the Tarn stands Florac, the seat of a sub-prefecture, with an old castle, an alley of plains, many quaint street corners, and a live fountain welling from a wall. It is notable, besides, for handsome women, and as one of the two capitals, Alès being the other, of the country of the Camisards. The landlord of the inn took me, after we had eaten, to an adjoining café, where I, or rather my journey, became the topic of the afternoon. Everyone had some suggestion for my guidance, and the sub-prefectorial map was fetched and much thumbed among coffee-cups and glasses of liqueur. We left Florac late in the afternoon, a tired donkey and a tired donkey driver. A little way up the Tarnon, a covered bridge of wood introduced us into the valley of the Mimont. Steep, rocky red mountains overhung the stream. Great oaks and chestnuts grew upon the slopes or in stony terraces. Here and there was a red field of millet or a few apple trees studded with red apples, and the road passed hard by 2 black hamlets, one with an old castle atop, to please the heart of the tourist. It was difficult here again to find a spot fit for my encampment. The valley was already full of the lowing sound of herdsmen's horns, when I spied a bight of meadow some way below the roadway in the angle of the river. I approached a great oak in this meadow, hard by the river's brink, when, to my disgust, the voices of children fell upon my ear, and I beheld a house round the angle on the other bank. I had half a mind to pack and be gone again, but the growing darkness moved me to remain. I had only to make no noise until the night was fairly come, and trust to the dawn to call me early in the morning. But it was hard to be annoyed by neighbours in such a hotel. A great hollow underneath the oak was my bed. Before I had fed Modestine and arranged my sack, 3 stars were already brightly shining, and the others were beginning dimly to appear. I slipped down to the river, which looked very black among its rocks, to fill my can, and dined with good appetite in the dark, for I scrupled to light a lantern while so near a house. No one knows the stars who has not slept, as the French happily put it, à la belle étoile. He may know their names and distances and magnitudes, and yet be ignorant of what alone concerns mankind, that serene and gladsome influence on the mind. The greater part of poetry is about the stars, and very justly, for they are themselves the most classical of poets. These same faraway worlds, sprinkled like tapers or shaken together like a diamond dust upon the sky, had looked not otherwise to Roland or Cavalier, when, in the words of the latter, they had no other tent but the sky, and no other bed than my mother earth. All night long a strong wind blew up the valley, and the acorns fell pattering over me from the oak. Yet on this first night of October the air was as mild as May, and I slept with the fur thrown back. I was much disturbed by the barking of a dog, an animal that I fear more than any wolf. A dog is vastly braver, and is besides supported by the sense of duty. If you kill a wolf, you meet with encouragement and praise, but if you kill a dog, the sacred right of property and the domestic affections come clamouring round you for redress. At the end of a fagging day, the sharp, cruel note of a dog's bark is in itself a keen annoyance, and to a tramp like myself, he represents the sedentary and respectable world in its most hostile form. There is something of the clergyman or the lawyer about this engaging animal, and if he were not amenable to stones, the boldest man would shrink from travelling afoot. I respect dogs much, in the domestic circle, but on the highway or sleeping afield I both detest and fear them. I was wakened next morning by the same dog, for I knew his bark, making a charge down the bank, and then, seeing me sit up, retreating again with great alacrity. The stars were not quite extinguished. The heaven was of that enchanting mild grey blue of the early morn. A still, clear light began to fall, and the trees on the hillside were outlined sharply against the sky. As I began to go up the valley, a draught of wind came down out of the seat of the sunrise, although the clouds continued to run overhead in an almost contrary direction. A few steps further, and I saw a whole hillside gilded with the sun, and still a little beyond, between 2 peaks, a centre of dazzling brilliancy appeared, floating in the sky, and I was once more face to face with the big bonfire that occupies the kernel of our system. I was now drawing near to Cassagna, a cluster of black roofs upon the hillside, amongst chestnut gardens, and looked upon in the clear air by many rocky peaks. When Louis XVI, in the words of the edict, convinced by the uselessness of a century of persecutions, and rather from necessity than sympathy, granted at last a royal grace of toleration, Cassagna was still Protestant, and to a man it is so to this day. There is indeed one family that is not Protestant, but neither is it Catholic. It is that of a Catholic curé in revolt, who has taken to his bosom a schoolmistress, and his conduct, it is worth noting, is disapproved by the Protestant villagers. "It is a bad idea for a man," said one, "to go back from his engagements." The villagers whom I saw seemed intelligent, after a countrified fashion, and were all plain and dignified in manner. As a Protestant myself, I was well looked upon, and my acquaintance with history gained me further respect. For we had something not unlike a religious controversy at the table, a gendarme and a merchant with whom I dined being both strangers to the place and Catholics. The young men of the town stood round and supported me, and the whole discussion was tolerantly conducted, and surprised a man brought up among the infinitesimal and contentious differences of Scotland. The merchant, indeed, grew a little warm, and was far less pleased than some others with my historical acquirements. But the gendarme was mighty easy over it all. "It's a bad idea for a man to change," said he, and the remark was generally applauded. The merchant was much interested in my journey, and thought it dangerous to sleep afield. "There are wolves," he said, "and then it is known you are an Englishman. The English have always long purses, and it might very well enter into someone's head to deal you an ill blow some night." I told him I was not much afraid of such accidents, and judged it unwise to dwell upon alarms or consider small perils in the arrangement of life. Life itself, I submitted, was a far too risky business as a whole to make each additional particular of danger worth regard. "Something," said I, "might burst in your inside any day of the week, and there would be an end of you, if you were locked into your room with 3 turns of the key." "Cependant," said he, "couchez dehors." "God," said I, "is everywhere." "Cependant, couchez dehors," he repeated, and his voice was eloquent of terror. He was the only person in all my voyage who saw anything hardy in so simple a proceeding, although many considered it superfluous. Only one, on the other hand, professed much delight in the idea, and that was a Plymouth brother, who cried out when I told him I sometimes preferred sleeping under the stars to a close and noisy alehouse, "Now I see that you know the Lord." A little after 2, I struck across the Mimont and took a rugged path southward up a hillside, covered with loose stones and tufts of heather. At the top, as is the habit of the country, the path disappeared. You may take this ridge as lying in the heart of the country of the Camisards. It was perhaps the wildest view of all my journey. Peak upon peak, chain upon chain of hills ran surging southward, channelled and sculptured by the winter streams, feathered from head to foot with chestnuts, and here and there breaking out into a coronal of cliffs. The sun, which was still far from setting, sent a drift of misty gold across the hilltops, but the valleys were already plunged in a profound and quiet shadow. A very old shepherd, hobbling on a pair of sticks and wearing a black cap of liberty, as if in honour of his nearness to the grave, directed me to the road for Saint-Germain-de-Colbert. There was something solemn in the isolation of this infirm and ancient creature. Where he dwelt, how he got upon this high ridge, or how he proposed to get down again, were more than I could fancy. Not far off upon my right was the famous Plan de Fontmort, where Poole, with his Armenian sabre, slashed down the Camisards of Séguier. This, methought, might be some Rip Van Winkle, fleeing before Poole and wandering ever since upon the mountains. It might be news to him that Cavalier had surrendered, or Roland had fallen fighting with his back against an olive. And while I was thus working on my fancy, I heard him hailing in broken tones, and saw him waving to me to come back with one of his 2 sticks. I had already got some way past him, but, leaving Modestine once more, retraced my steps. Alas, it was a very commonplace affair. The old gentleman had forgot to ask the pedlar what he sold, and wished to remedy this neglect. I told him sternly, "Nothing." "Nothing?" cried he. I repeated, "Nothing," and made off. It's odd to think of, but perhaps I thus became as inexplicable to the old man as he had been to me. It was a very solitary march all afternoon, and the evening began early underneath the trees. But I heard the voice of a woman singing some sad, old, endless ballad not far off. It seemed to be about love, and a belle amoureux, her handsome sweetheart. And I wished I could have answered her, as I went upon my invisible woodland way, weaving, like Pippa in the poem, my own thoughts with hers. We struck at last into a wide white highroad, carpeted with noiseless dust. The night had come. The moon had been shining for a long while upon the opposite mountain, when on turning a corner my donkey and I issued ourselves into her light. The road wound and descended swiftly among masses of chestnuts. Hot dust rose from our feet and flowed away. Our two shadows, mine deformed with the knapsack, hers comically bestridden by the pack, now lay before us clearly outlined on the road, and now, as we turned a corner, went off into the ghostly distance and sailed along the mountain like clouds. From time to time, a warm wind rustled down the valley and set all the chestnuts dangling their bunches of foliage and fruit, and the ear was filled with whispering music, and the shadows danced in tune. And next moment the breeze had gone by, and in all the valley nothing moved except our travelling feet. On the opposite slope, the monstrous ribs and gullies of the mountain were faintly designed in the moonshine, and high overhead, in some lone house, there burned one lighted window, one square spark of red in the huge field of sad nocturnal colouring. At a certain point, as I went downward, turning many acute angles, the moon disappeared behind the hill, and I pursued my way in great darkness, until another turning shot me without preparation into Saint-Germain-de-Colbert. The place was asleep and silent, and buried in opaque night. Only from a single open door some lamplight escaped upon the road to show me I was come among men's habitations. The two last gossips of the evening, still talking by a garden wall, directed me to the inn. The landlady was getting her chicks to bed. The fire was already out, and had, not without grumbling, to be rekindled. Half an hour later, and I must have gone supperless to roost.
Alan Cumming was reading the 7th episode of Travels with a Donkey in the Cevennes by Robert Louis Stevenson. Travels with a Donkey in the Cevennes by Robert Louis Stevenson. Episode 8, Farewell, Modestine.
When I awoke, and hearing a great flourishing of cocks and chuckling of contented hens betook me to the window of the clean and comfortable room where I had slept the night, I looked forth on a sunshiny morning in a deep vale of chestnut gardens. It was still early, and the cock-crows and the slanting lights and the long shadows encouraged me to be out and look around me. Saint-Germain-de-Colbert is a great parish, 9 leagues round about. At the period of the wars, and immediately before the devastation, it was inhabited by 275 families, of which only 9 were Catholic, and it took the curé 17 September days to go from house to house on horseback for a census. But the place itself, although capital of a canton, is scarce larger than a hamlet. It lies terraced across a steep slope in the midst of mighty chestnuts. The Protestant chapel stands below upon a shoulder. In the midst of the town is the quaint old Catholic church. It was here that poor Duchela, the Christian martyr, kept his library and held a court of missionaries. Here he had built his tomb, thinking to lie among a grateful population he had redeemed from error, and hither on the morrow of his death they brought the body, pierced with 52 wounds, to be interred. Clad in his priestly robes, he was laid out in state in the church. The curé, taking his text from 2 Samuel, 20th chapter and 12th verse, "And Amasa wallowed in his blood in the highway," preached a rousing sermon, and exhorted his brethren to die each at his post, like their unhappy and illustrious superior. In the midst of this eloquence there came a breeze that Spirit Segye was near at hand, and behold, all the assembly took to their horses' heels, some east, some west, and the curé himself as far as Alès. Strange was the position of this little Catholic metropolis, a thimbleful of Rome, in such a wild and contrary neighbourhood. On the one hand, the Legion of Salomon overlooked it from Cassagna. On the other, it was cut off from assistance by the Legion of Roland at Mialet. The curé, Louvrenlille, although he took a panic at the archpriest's funeral, and so hurriedly decamped to Alès, stood well by his isolated pulpit, and thence uttered fulminations against the crimes of the Protestants. Solomon besieged the village for an hour and a half, but was beaten back. The militiamen on guard before the curé's door could be heard in the black hours singing Protestant psalms and holding friendly talk with the insurgents. And in the morning, although not a shot had been fired, there would not be a round of powder in their flasks. Where was it gone? All handed over to the Camisard. For a consideration. Untrusty guardians for an isolated priest. That these continual stirs were once busy in Saint-Germain-de-Colbert, the imagination with difficulty receives. All is now so quiet. The pulse of human life now beats so low and still in this hamlet of the mountains. Boys followed me a great way off, like timid lion hunters, and people turned round to have a second look, or came out of their houses as I went by. My passage was the first event you would have fancied since the Camisards. There was nothing rude or forward in this observation. It was but a pleased and wondering scrutiny, like that of oxen or the human infant. Yet it wearied my spirits, and soon drove me from the street. I took refuge on the terraces, greenly carpeted with sward, and tried to imitate with a pencil the inimitable attitudes of the chestnuts as they bear up their canopy of leaves. Ever and again a little wind went by, and the nuts dropped all round me, with a light and dull sound upon the sward. The noise was as of a thin fall of great hailstones, but there went with it a cheerful human sentiment of an approaching harvest, and farmers rejoicing in their gains. Looking up, I could see the brown nut peering through the husk, which was already gaping, and between the stems the eye embraced an amphitheatre of hill, sunlit and green with leaves. I dined with a pair of Catholics. They agreed in the condemnation of a young man, a Catholic, who had married a Protestant girl and gone over to the religion of his wife. A Protestant born they could understand and respect. Indeed, they seemed to be of the mind of an old Catholic woman who told me that same day there was no difference between the two sects, save that wrong was more wrong for the Catholic, who had more light and guidance. But this of a man's desertion filled them with contempt. "It's a bad idea for a man to change," said one. It may have been accidental, but you see how this phrase pursued me. And for myself, I believe it is the current philosophy in these parts. I have some difficulty in imagining a better. It's not only a great flight of confidence for a man to change his creed and go out of his family for heaven's sake, but the odds are, nay, and the hope is, that with all this great transition in the eyes of man, he has not changed himself a hair's breadth in the eyes of God. Honour to those who do, for the wrench is sore. But it argues something narrow, whether of strength or weakness, whether of the prophet or the fool, in those who can take a sufficient interest in such infinitesimal and human operations, or who can quit a friendship for a doubtful process of the mind. And I think I should not leave my old creed for another, changing only words for other words, but by some brave reading embrace it in spirit and truth, and find wrong as wrong for me as for the best of other communions. The phylloxera was in the neighbourhood, and instead of wine we drank at dinner a more economical juice of the grape, La Parisienne, they call it. It is made by putting the fruit whole into a cask with water. One by one the berries ferment and burst. What is drunk during the day is supplied at night in water. So, with ever another pitcher from the well, and ever another grape exploding and giving out its strength, one cask of Parisienne may last a family until spring. It is, as might be anticipated, a feeble beverage, but very pleasant to the taste. What with dinner and coffee, it was long past 3 before I left Saint-Germain-de-Colbert. I went down beside the garden of Mialet, a great glaring watercourse devoid of water, and through Saint-Étienne-de-Vallée-Française, or Val-Francesque, as they used to call it, and towards evening began to ascend the hill of Saint-Pierre. It was a long and steep ascent. Behind me, an empty carriage returning to Saint-Jean-du-Gard kept hard upon my tracks, and near the summit overtook me. The driver, like the rest of the world, was sure I was a pedlar, but unlike the others, he was sure of what I had to sell. He had noticed the blue wool which hung out of my pack at either end, and from this he had decided, beyond my power to alter his decision, that I dealt in blue wool collars, such as decorate the neck of the French draught horse. I had hurried to the topmost powers of Modestine, for I dearly desired to see the view upon the other side before the day had faded. But it was night when I reached the summit, and the moon was riding high and clear, and only a few grey streaks of twilight lingered in the west. A yawning valley, gulfed in blackness, lay like a hole in created nature at my feet, but the outline of the hills was sharp against the sky. There was Mount Aigual, the stronghold of Castanet, and Castanet, not only as an active undertaking leader, deserves some mention among Camisards, for there is a spray of rose among his laurel, and he showed how even in a public tragedy love will have its way. In the high tide of war he married in his mountain citadel a young and pretty lass called Mariette. There were great rejoicings, and the bridegroom released 25 prisoners in honour of the glad event. 7 months afterwards, Mariette, the Princess of the Cevennes, as they called her in derision, fell into the hands of the authorities, where it was like to have gone hard with her. But Castanet was a man of execution and loved his wife. He fell on Vallerogue and got a lady there for a hostage, and for the first and last time in that war there was an exchange of prisoners. Their daughter, pledge of some starry night upon Mount Aigual, has left descendants to this day. Modestine and I, it was our last meal together, had a snack upon the top of Saint-Pierre on a heap of stones, she standing by me in the moonlight and decorously eating bread out of my hand. The poor brute would eat more heartily in this manner, for she had a sort of affection for me, which I was soon to betray. It was a long descent upon Saint-Jean-du-Gard, and we met no one but a carter, visible afar off by the glint of the moon on his extinguished lantern. Before 10 o'clock we had got in and were at supper. 15 miles and a stiff hill in little beyond 6 hours. On examination on the morning of October the 4th, Modestine was pronounced unfit for travel. She would need at least 2 days' repose according to the ostler. But I was now eager to reach Alès for my letters, and being in a civilized country of stagecoaches, I determined to sell my lady friend and be off by the diligence that afternoon. Our yesterday's march, with the testimony of the driver who had pursued us up the long hill of Saint-Pierre, spread a favourable notion of my donkey's capabilities. Intending purchasers were aware of an unrivalled opportunity. Before 10 I had an offer of 25 francs, and before noon, after a desperate engagement, I sold her, saddle and all, for 35. The pecuniary gain is not obvious, but I had bought freedom into the bargain. Saint-Jean-du-Gard is a large place and largely Protestant. The mayor, a Protestant, asked me to help him in a small matter itself characteristic of the country. The young women of the Cevennes profit, by the common religion and the difference of the language, to go as governesses into England, and here was one, a native of Mialet, struggling with English circulars from 2 different agencies in London. I gave what help I could, and volunteered some advice, which struck me as being excellent. One thing more I note. The phylloxera has ravaged the vineyards in this neighbourhood, and in the early morning, under some chestnuts by the river, I found a party of men working with a cider press. I could not at first work out what they were after, and asked one fellow to explain. "Making cider," he said. "Oui, comme ça, comme dans le Nord." There was a ring of sarcasm in his voice. The country was going to the devil. It was not until I was fairly seated by the driver and rattling through a rocky valley with dwarf olives that I became aware of my bereavement. I had lost Modestine. Up to that moment I had thought I hated her. But now she was gone, and, oh, the difference to me. For 12 days we had been fast companions. We had travelled upwards of 120 miles, crossed several respectable ridges, and jogged along with our 6 legs by many a rocky and many a boggy by-road. After the first day, although sometimes I was hurt and distant in manner, I still kept my patience. And as for her, poor soul, she had come to regard me as a god. She loved to eat out of my hand. She was patient, elegant in form, the colour of an ideal mouse, and inimitably small. Her faults were those of her race and sex. Her virtues were her own. Farewell, and if for ever... Father Adam wept when he sold her to me. After I had sold her in my turn, I was tempted to follow his example. And being alone with a stage driver and 4 or 5 agreeable young men, I did not hesitate to yield to my emotion.
Alan Cumming was reading the final episode of Travels with a Donkey in the Cevennes by Robert Louis Stevenson, abridged in 8 parts by Stuart Kahn. The producer was Tamsin Collison.
We are now pleased to present an edition of Great Lives from 2005, in which presenter Francine Stock discusses the life of Robert Louis Stevenson.
Hello. Great Lives gives a living figure the chance to champion someone from the past, and with me today is Douglas Dunn, Professor of English and Director of the Centre for Scottish Studies at the University of St Andrews. He's probably better known, though, as one of Britain's finest poets. 11 volumes of poetry since his first collection in 1969, short stories, plays. He's also an editor and critic. The death of his first wife from cancer in 1981 was the subject of his poetic sequence Elegies, the Whitbread Book of the Year in 1985, and in 2003 he received the OBE. Douglas Dunn, who do you propose as a great life, and why?
I propose Robert Louis Stevenson. He is a hero of mine. I very much like his life. A figure who influenced my reading very much in childhood, because I didn't get Alice in Wonderland or that kind of children's books. I got Sir Walter Scott and Robert Louis Stevenson. A writer I've very much loved ever since. Treasure Island was the first sustained novel I ever read, with the result that I became addicted to books that had maps in them. Treasure Island has got adventure scenes, and one of which I used to play on the stairs in my parents' house with 2 toy revolvers. You know, the scene where Jim is up the mast and Mr. Hands comes up with a knife, pins him to the mast by the shoulder, and Jim Hawkins says, "One more step, Mr. Hands, and I'll blow your brains out." And then he adds, "Dead men don't bite," I added with a chuckle. Boom, boom.
Robert Louis Stevenson, who was born in Edinburgh in 1850 and died on the Pacific island of Samoa 44 years later. He was the writer of the classic tales Treasure Island, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Kidnapped, which of course was recently dramatised on BBC television. Well, here's how he described himself in a letter to J.M. Barrie the year before he died, and the actor Alec Westwood is here to read for us.
Exceedingly lean, dark, rather ruddy, black eyes, crow's-footed, beginning to be grizzled, the general appearance of a blasted boy, or blighted youth, or to borrow Carlyle on De Quincey, child that has been in hell. Past, eccentric, obscure, and we never mention it. Present, industrious, respectable, and fatuously contented. Hopelessly entangled in apron strings, drinks plenty, curses some, temper unstable, manners purple on an emergency, but liable to trances.
And that was Robert Louis Stevenson's self-portrait in sketch form. Our guide through the landscape of Stevenson's great life will be his most recent biographer, Claire Harmon, and you may have heard excerpts from her study of Stevenson when it was Radio 4's Book of the Week. Claire, he describes himself there as industrious, respectable and fatuously contented. Do you think that's a fair description of Stevenson towards the end of his short life?
No, it's deliberately ironic, and the words jump out, don't they? Blasted, entangled, unstable. There, it's full of these key words about a lot of disruption in his life that he was trying to pass off as a sort of joke. But we all know now, since Freud, that there's no such thing as a plain joke.
Well, let's go now right to the beginnings. He was born in Edinburgh in 1850, bang in the middle of the 19th century, from a solid bourgeois family who were engineers, and they'd specialised rather in lighthouses and harbours. The only child of rather protective parents. Interesting observations on family life he made. He talked about it being a picnic on a volcano, some reference possibly to his relationship with his father. Much of his care was given over to a strict Calvinist nurse, Alison Cunningham, known as Cummy. Claire, it sounds like a very unsettling mixture of intensity and distance there.
Yes, it was a feverish household. I mean, he was a feverish child in a literal sense, but also there was that concentration of love on the one and only child, who was an ill child and who might die at any time. He was really the focus of a lot of fretful love, and it's clear that he struggled against the bad effects of that, and he tried to hang on to the very strong feelings that his parents had for him. But it was very troublesome too. I mean, his father was clearly a very intense man, very unstable man. So there's a great deal of anxiety and jealousy and strife there. But that phrase, picnic on a volcano, is so brilliantly descriptive of the jollity that they attempted and did actually achieve, as well as the volcanic likelihood of everything going horribly wrong.
These long spells in bed, Douglas, and the ill health, I mean, it does sound like the classic hothouse for the fevered imagination.
Yeah, not only did Stevenson spend long periods in bed, so did his mother.
Yes.
His mother spent most of his childhood in bed. And these are classic symptoms, I suppose, of manic depressive illness. And that did run in the family. He has a beautiful essay in which he talks about the discovery of private reading and the consolations of living in the imagination. And I think he was that kind of child.
This is an interesting point, because obviously his formal schooling might have been disrupted by the ill health, but he failed to follow the family line on engineering. Although he studied law, he didn't actually practice. It meant that his father was actually supporting him financially until, well into his 30s.
Yes, it was a strange sort of revenge in a way that the son was taking out on the parents, challenging them to quantify how much they loved him and how far they'd support him. But Stevenson did remain a sort of dependent for a long time, and then he switched instantly from being a dependent to being exactly what his father had been, somebody who's supporting a lot of other people. So there was no kind of normal period of Stevenson's life where he earned money just for himself.
As a young man, Robert Louis Stevenson was convinced he would die young, and writing was a way to immortality. Toiling, he said, to leave a memory behind me. He worked at it consciously with determination.
Nobody had ever such pains to learn a trade as I had, but I slogged at it day in, day out, and I frankly believe that, thanks to my dire industry, I have done more with smaller gifts than almost any man of letters in the world. Whenever I read a book or passage that particularly pleased me, in which a thing was said or an effect rendered with propriety, in which there was either some conspicuous force or some happy distinction in the style, I must sit down at once and set myself to ape that quality. I was unsuccessful, and I knew it, and tried again, and I was again unsuccessful, and always unsuccessful. But at least in these vain bouts, I got some practice in rhythm, in harmony, in construction, and the coordination of parts.
Now, Stevenson, the man, and his appearance, which was quite dramatic. If you look at the photographs of him, he's lean, he has this centre-parted, longish hair, droopy moustache, large, expressive eyes. Overall appearance one probably could sum up as frail but quite intense.
Yes, certainly. The eyes have it, I think, that oddly misaligned look is probably a great deal of his mesmeric appeal to people, and a lot of contemporaries who described meeting Stevenson talk about his charisma in terms of almost being hypnotised by him. But he was outstandingly thin as well, and worryingly so. I mean, I think all through his adult life there was never a time when he got above about 9.5 stone. I mean, he was really quite spectral.
He was very bohemian looking, he had long hair and a velvet smoking jacket, which I think was a constant throughout his life.
Yes, he acquired one when he was in his late teens, and it was such a success for his ego. He just loved it. It was not what people wore out on the street normally. It was a smoking jacket, but he adopted it. And he was reading Baudelaire, and he was being a little outpost of Paris up there in Edinburgh.
Well, he was a very complete Francophile.
Yes.
That's one of the reasons why I like him, because I tend to be too. And he was bohemian, and he made a gallant effort to live life to the full, as if he knew that he did have a deadline, which I always find affecting when I read biographies of him.
And this great sense of fun as well.
Let us be fools, my friend. Let us be drunken. Let us be angry and extremely silly.
There was this concept, jink, surreal pranks, Claire.
Yes.
What was it?
Oh, it was wonderful. He and his cousin Bob and some of his other friends who had a sort of subversive gang, they used to go around and play very elaborate pranks. And they targeted the most pompous citizens that they knew, and they'd involve them in these long, elaborate practical jokes, acting out little scenes that they were making up impromptu and just to agitate people, really. It was a kind of performance art, I think. But it was a form of practical joking that was taken several steps further than any normal people would do, purely for that love of outraging the bourgeois, and there are plenty of bourgeois to outrage in Edinburgh.
You can still come across young men like that in Edinburgh to this day. I've taught them. I've had them as students. They tend not to turn up very often, and when they do, their presence is not really much worth having. But they do exist.
Yes.
And they even look like that. They even look slightly Stevensonian. Tall and thin, well-mannered, but with a streak of wildness.
But on the one side, you had this great charm and the generosity, and that he could be so entertaining. But then still these fits of morbid melancholy. Do you think these days it would have simply been described as depression?
It's hard to tell where depression ends and literature begins, isn't it? I mean, Stevenson was very dependent on his mood swings in some ways. He had made himself the subject of most of his own writing. I mean, it does revolve around his ego. Even when he's writing his early travel books, they are actually much more about travels into his own mind, which is why he does seem very modern to us now, because he's got that psychological astuteness.
And in this way that he went travelling, both literally, physically, and also into himself. For example, he went to France initially for health reasons when he was travelling with his parents. But later his first proper book would be about a canoeing holiday on the French canals.
By a curious irony of fate, the places to which we are sent when health deserts us are often singularly beautiful. I dare say the sick man is not very inconsolable when he receives sentence of banishment and is inclined to regard his ill health as not the least fortunate accident of his life.
He had already become involved in his early 20s in an affair, albeit unconsummated, with one older woman, Mrs. Frances Sitwell. But in France, in late summer 1876, he fell for an American, Fanny Osborne, who was 10 years older than him. She was married but separated with 2 teenage children, and she was grieving the loss of a third child. Fanny Osborne was described as short. She seems to have been rather sexy, with a pistol-shot glance. When she wasn't eating, she was smoking, and there were strange stories of life among the Nevada mines. Douglas, can you understand what might have been so fascinating about Fanny Osborne?
I think she was possibly a breath of fresh air compared to many of the women he had met, many of the respectable women he had met up to that date. She was certainly lively and vivacious, possibly a bit of a bully, and perhaps he liked that. And also, an affair with her would have been very much in keeping with his personality, which was to go for the unexpected, the revolutionary, if you like.
Certainly a great contrast in their appearance when all these images, everyone shows her as solid, as he is willowy, Claire.
There's a kind of Jack Sprat horrible undertone to that, isn't there? And she was described in rather cruel ways several times, because she was a very short woman and she was not thin.
Well, Sidney Colvin called her that maniac partner with the build and character of Napoleon Bonaparte. Even Robert Louis Stevenson, writing to Henry James, said, "My wife is a woman, as you know, not without art, the art of extracting the gloom of the eclipse from sunshine." This was going to be more than mere gloom, though, wasn't it? Eventually this would turn to a kind of psychosis.
Yes, although those all make her sound terrible, and it's very easy to criticise Fanny Stevenson. I mean, she seems to be an appalling person for him to have settled down with. But clearly he was absolutely no fool. I mean, Stevenson was totally dependent on her for many things, and she on him. And it really worked, but from the outside of that relationship, it looked and looks really rather awful. So that's just one of the mysteries of love, isn't it?
Now, when they eventually married, after some toing and froing beforehand, they spent the first few months of their life in a shack in an abandoned mining town, Silverado. It was almost as if in this marriage, where there were already extremes of behaviour, they pushed themselves to the extremes, don't they?
Yeah, they seem to have courted them. I think it was a relationship between two extremes. And I think Stevenson's friends failed to understand that. You must remember that most of Stevenson's male friends were practically in love with him, judging by the nature of their correspondence. And so they were just terribly disappointed in Lewis's choice. And so they started mounting a kind of campaign against her, it seems to me.
But marriage, of course, seemed to bring no urge to settle down to either of them, although they had various bouts of ill health. The couple were travelling constantly. They lived in Davos in Switzerland, where consumptives traditionally sought a cure, and in Bournemouth and the south of France. But despite bleeding from damaged lungs, Robert Louis Stevenson's output was prodigious. Treasure Island, Kidnapped, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and The Black Arrow. It's impressive, isn't it, Douglas, the idea that he may have been bedridden some of the time, but he was still turning out all this fiction.
No, his productivity is terrific, and it's in such a variety of forms. Also his extravagance. He was a tremendously extravagant man with money. Not only was keeping a wife and her family, and they had no children of their own, but he undertakes these voyages, the renting of substantial vessels and the payment of the captains and crews. And then on Samoa has an estate and erects a very substantial dwelling that when the place became administered by the Germans as part of their empire, the German governor took it over as his residence.
This is Great Lives on Radio 4, where the poet Douglas Dunn is celebrating Robert Louis Stevenson with his biographer Claire Harmon. Well, let's go back to the 1880s, and Stevenson is in his 30s, and the works of fiction that probably we know best are written then. Treasure Island, 1883, which was begun apparently when he drew up a treasure map to amuse his stepson.
That was a wet holiday that turned into a storytelling bout, and the storytelling turned into a novel. He wrote a chapter a day of the first 15 chapters of Treasure Island, including those fantastically gripping first chapters with Billy Bones at the Admiral Benbow Inn. And that was just coming out hot and hot, as he would have said, every day while the rain fell in Braemar, and his 12-year-old stepson needed something to be entertained by. The holiday ended, and, the rain stopped, and the holiday ended, and he got to chapter 15 or 16, and you can actually see that in the book, the point at which he loses ground, and he has the scene where Jim goes round in the coracle. It's kind of going round and round the island and he can't find the boat. And it's very evocative of Stevenson's own problem with what was going to happen, because he didn't know how the story was going to end. In fact, Young Folks magazine had taken the story and were starting to publish it, and Stevenson hadn't written the end yet.
Well, here he is in almost manic mood, selling the idea of Treasure Island to his friend in a letter to W.E. Henley.
If this don't fetch the kids, why, they have gone rotten since my day. Will you be surprised to learn that it begins in the Admiral Benbow public house on the Devon coast, that it's all about a map and a treasure and a mutiny and a derelict ship and a current and a fine old Squire Trelawney and a doctor and another doctor and a sea cook with one leg and a sea song with the chorus, yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum.
Treasure Island, which was sold by Robert Louis Stevenson in instalments to a boy's paper, as was The Black Arrow, Kidnapped, and then in 1886 along came The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
I compounded the elements, watched them boil and smoke together in the glass, and when the ebullition had subsided, with a strong glow of courage, drank off the potion. The most racking pangs succeeded, a grinding in the bones, deadly nausea, and a horror of the spirit that cannot be exceeded at the hour of birth or death. And then these agonies began swiftly to subside, and I came to myself as if out of a great sickness. There was something strange in my sensations, something indescribably new, and from its very novelty, incredibly sweet. I felt younger, lighter, happier in body. Within, I was conscious of a heady recklessness, a current of disordered, sensual images running like a mill race in my fancy, a solution of the bonds of obligation, an unknown but not an innocent freedom of the soul. I knew myself, at the first breath of this new life, to be more wicked, tenfold more wicked, sold a slave to my original evil. And the thought, in that moment, braced and delighted me like wine.
So fantastic, heady stuff there, Douglas. And you can't ignore, obviously, the central theme of duality. Now, what do you think it might really be about?
Well, first of all, I think the feeling behind the story comes from late Victorian apprehension about the development of science and especially chemistry and about what it could do. Just as we're very concerned today with cloning, for example, and genetics, there was a similar apprehension in the 1880s. And I think that's probably where the story comes from. And I think that's one of the reasons why his narrative method is so impressive, because the very way in which he tells the story creates an instability, so that the reader is always being slightly wrong-footed. And so much of it happens in the dark. And so much of Stevenson's stories happen in the dark. He's a very nocturnal writer.
It's very hard, though, in this post-Freudian world, not to read in it a much more personal interpretation that there is something, this is coded repression of some kind, though, Claire, isn't it? Whether it's homosexuality or drugs or whatever it is.
Well, it does refer to alcoholism and drug dependency and changed mental states through those things. Addiction, addictive personalities, self-destruction through whatever means. But Stevenson himself was very disturbed at how the story, because it was a bestseller immediately, and it passed into popular culture very, very quickly, and there were stage versions and that he felt were inappropriate. And he said that Hyde is not a voluptuary. I mean, the earlier stage adaptation had a prostitute put into it. There's no prostitute in the story. There are no women in the story apart from the odd, maidservant, people like that. But later adaptations have always put in a female figure. And Stevenson himself said it wasn't what Hyde was doing as such with whoever. It's the evil in him. It's a much purer story about how evil can take over and how it's inherent in everybody. It's not, you don't have to be a dysfunctional person, that given that kind of liberty, when Jekyll describes that mill race of feelings, that kind of license, when you license yourself to do things, all sorts of stuff comes out. It's not just about drink or drugs or sex, it's about self-licensing and letting that policeman in the soul go, and just being allowed to do what you like.
I see it in the context of Stevenson's other fictions and their attraction towards the nocturnal and to phantasmagoria. What accumulates throughout his stories is this dream world, this fantastic world, full of doors, especially back doors, full of all kinds of
dark
symbolism.
alleyways.
Yeah. Of the three all-time best-selling works, entire generations may have come first to Robert Louis Stevenson through A Child's Garden of Verses. Claire, what made this different from previous volumes of poetry for children?
Stevenson was actually imagining himself back into his childhood and writing as if children had brains, which they do. He wasn't sentimentalising childhood at all. He was actually re-inhabiting it. I mean, children had been written down to horribly before then, and he was just instantly capable of giving that extra twist to children's poems, because, I mean, they're beautiful as rhymes. They're fantastically well written, very memorable. I mean, we all know them, even if you don't know that they're by Stevenson. Half a dozen of those poems are absolutely standard nursery classics.
Faster than fairies, faster than witches, bridges and houses, hedges and ditches, and charging along like troops in a battle, all through the meadows their horses and cattle. All of the sights of the hill and the plain fly as thick as driving rain, and ever again, in the wink of an eye, painted stations whistle by. Here is a child who clambers and scrambles, all by himself and gathering brambles. Here is a tramp who stands and gazes, and there is the green for stringing the daisies. Here is a cart run away in the road, lumping along with man and load. And here is a mill, and there is a river, each a glimpse and gone forever.
Well, in 1888, a year after the death of his father, Stevenson decided to take a South Sea cruise, going, he said, the full pitch for 7 months. If I cannot get my health back, 'tis madness. But of course, there is the hope, and I will play big. Douglas Dunn, is it surprising, do you think, in many ways, that that gamble seemed to pay off, that Samoa suited him so well?
Well, I think it must have been something Stevenson could hardly have predicted, because he spent some time in Hawaii, first of all, and he wrote ballads and so on for the royal family. Hawaii had a king at that time before it became American. But that voyage from San Francisco, even today that would be quite a sail, especially on a ship such as that.
And these extraordinary photographs from his time in Samoa show him garlanded with flowers, and I mean, it's a long way from Edinburgh, but he clearly looks in his element, doesn't he?
He does. He became a kind of Southwest Pacific laird.
And Claire, how easy did he find it to write there, and what indeed did the distance do to his perception of Scotland?
He found it very easy to write there on the whole, and he had, in his large household, he had a stepdaughter who was very willing to be an amanuensis, so there was a sort of production line element to his years in Samoa. And his Scottish novels of that period are very distinctively obsessed with homesickness and with being away from the landscape. He evokes the landscape incredibly well. He must have had a really good sensory memory, because he can always get several different sense impressions, and they're very accurate. You know, he hadn't been in Scotland for some years, but he can describe the smells, the look of small plants by the side of a road. I mean, there's something really detailed, as if he's got a little video camera in his head and he can replay it.
So in the late 1880s and early 1890s, he produces from Samoa the later fiction, The Master of Ballantrae, Katrina, which is the sequel to Kidnapped, and the unfinished Ware of Hermiston. But also, because of this intense sympathy for the culture of Samoa and Tahiti, he planned a history and wrote polemics to the Times about the threat to the lives of the South Sea Islanders from Western imperialism. Clearly he was surprisingly fulfilled in Samoa, but what about Fanny, his wife?
Well, in a way, because Stevenson's health had improved, a lot of the balance was shifting, I think, during those years. And so he was no longer the bedridden invalid. He was actually getting up and doing a lot of very heavy weeding work and estate overseeing. I think they were all pretty ineffective, actually, as landowners and farmers, yes. And they were very bad business people. But Stevenson was actually physically far more active, and he was riding his horse up and down to town, his terrible shabby little ex-tramcar horse, and he was really enjoying a sort of new lease of life, which, you know, may have been fairly disturbing for a woman who'd got so used to nursing him. But of course the scene changed and certainly seemed to not knit together so much in Samoa as to come unstuck.
And he was also living in proximity to adventure in the middle of a civil war on the islands, and he took the side of the underdog, as it were,
yes,
and not the side of that was being sponsored by the Germans, for example. And I've read 2 New Zealand historians on the subject who accuse Stevenson of terrible irresponsibility, of being misled by his own personality and interest in adventure, and that he possibly even ran guns to the Samoan faction, King Matafa, whom he supported.
It's possible, because he had some guns. Stevenson was somebody who was interested in war games, very elaborate ones with hundreds of dead soldiers, and he was interested in military history, and he was interested in adventure stories, and this all sort of came into three-dimensional being in Samoa. So he was taking his kind of playfulness to slightly irresponsible extremes, I think, there.
And despite his comparatively robust and tanned-looking appearance in those final photographs, Robert Louis Stevenson did die suddenly of a brain hemorrhage at the age of 44, and he was buried on a hilltop in Samoa. Douglas Dunn, let's at this point try and nail what it is you think is truly great about Robert Louis Stevenson.
It's Stevenson's struggle with his sense of identity that I identify with myself, and his aspiration to be honest to his imagination and to his experience, and to try and create new experience. Lots of people advise younger writers to write about what you know. Stevenson would have rejected that completely. Write about what you can invent, and write about what you can find out.
Douglas Dunn, thank you very much indeed. Thanks also to the biographer Claire Harmon and to the actor Alec Westwood for his readings. Let's end with the epitaph Stevenson composed for himself when he was 33. It's one of the best known and most often misquoted epitaphs ever written.
This be the verse you grave for me. Here he lies, where he longed to be,